Ever been curious about how to put one of these on one of these? Well, we just talked all about that with Ryan Muckenhern here. Mounting methods, type of optics used, applications used in, whether slug guns, turkey guns, even potentially guns for trap shooting and wing shooting. Who knows? Chat all about that in this one. Check it out. Let us know what you think. We got a ton of requests for this topic. We love getting requests, so keep those coming as well. Thanks, guys.
All right, everybody. I think we've done a couple of episodes on shotguns now, and once you get bit by the shotgun bug, you just stick with it. It's not a bad bug to get bit by. And we're going to talk more about shotguns here. I mean, you can go back and listen to all kinds of stuff about shells. We've done stuff on chokes, turkey loads. This one in particular is going to be about optics on shotguns. I'm feeling really good now, too, because Ryan just talked me up big time on my Mossberg 500 Persuader that I previously had dogged on, which is apparently now the shotgun to have for the apocalypse.
Yes.
It's like the AK-47 of guns. When you said that, I don't know if you saw me beaming over here.
Well, it's like no wonder you were so naturally drawn to it.
Yeah. So long ago, first gun purchase ever.
It was in your DNA.
That's right. I looked up at the wall as an 18-year-old kid, and I saw the price of an actual AK-47, and I was like, I'll go for the shotgun version.
Subconscious.
Anyway, I don't have an optic on that one, and but I've thought about it many times. Optics on shotguns remind me somewhat of optics on handguns, in that it's a little bit the Wild West. Mm-hmm. I think it's been a thing for longer, the fact that people have been putting optics on, slug guns, maybe even scatter guns, I don't know. But it's been a thing a little bit longer, but there's so many ways you can do it. There's mounts that come up from over the side. There's, you can bolt on pretty much regular Picatinny-looking mounts. There's mounts that mash between the receiver and the stock. There's ones that go out on the rib. There's red dots. There's people who put magnified scopes on shotguns. By the way, we're here with Ryan Muckenhern too, and I forgot to say that. Usually I say who's here, but that time I forgot. Anyway, where does one begin? Why would you even want to put an optic on a shotgun? Maybe that's a place to start.
Well, I think that's a great place to start, and I love your pistol analogy though, Jim, because like a lot of these pistols, they haven't for a long time been coming with really like a way to intentionally put an optic. People are like altering or workaround, or you can do this, and and I feel like a lot of shotguns fall into that kind of that same predicament, or it's just kind of how they're made because they're not coming out intended to be used with an optic. Case in point, the one that I've got on the table right here. I love this shotgun. It's a Benelli M2. It served me quite well. Ryan actually did some handiwork on it fairly recently, not to put an optic on it, to do some different stuff. Actually, that might be a separate 10-minute talk, but yeah, I guess, and then to circle back to your question, Jim, why?
Yeah. I think one of the bigger appeals comes to the turkey hunter, and it has not been that long. I guess in the chronology or timeline of shotguns coming out onto the market, that there have been, quote, optics-ready shotguns like we see pistols. Okay, so you can go buy a Glock MOS and it has a slide cut out for it, or a Smith & Wesson M&P has a slide cut out for it.
Seems to be kind of, in the last 2 years or so, I've seen
it's really
more.
ramped up. Yeah. Really ramped up.
People really talking about optics-ready shotguns. Shotguns are designed for turkey hunting.
Yep.
With an optic.
Look at that Weatherby shotgun. Their turkey gun.
Yep. Browning's got one.
Yep. So
Browning has a break action one.
Yeah.
Just like my Synergy.
Yeah.
That's a cool one. Sorry.
And I think part of it comes from it's the modernization of the hunter. Because if we go back in time, let's say to the 1940s and 1950s, even into the 60s, more so with the Midwestern big game hunters, you didn't always see a telescopic rifle sight on the rifle. I mean, it was
right.
Yeah.
I've got a cool picture of Hemingway with an antelope, and he's got a 1903 Springfield sporterized, real nice looking rig. I think maybe even, done by a commercial outfit here in the U.S. with an antelope that he doesn't have a rifle scope on. I mean, that's crazy. Same thing with the shotguns, though. Like, for a long time, it just wasn't in the fashion to do it. But now as we have, choke tubes and shot shell loadings, like we talked about on our turkey shell podcast, what you can do with a shotgun is very different than what you could do with a shotgun probably even 10 years ago.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess the limitations at that point were not so much the gun as it was the ammunition. Well, now we've got this ammunition that throws volleyball-sized patterns at 40 yards. You can really, really squeeze out a lot of a shotgun with an optic on it. And I think back, what year is it? It's 2020 now, probably 2005 or 2006, I bought a shotgun expressly for turkey hunting from Winchester. It was the NWTF version of the Super X2. Regretfully, I sold it, and I'm not sure why, but it had a cantilever barrel like you would expect to see on a slug gun, but it had a smooth bore with changeable chokes. So the intent was turkey hunting exclusively.
Right.
Yep.
When you say a cantilevered barrel, that's an example of one method of mounting optics,
Correct.
which is where the rib essentially comes up and sort of
over
like
the
a
receiver.
diving board over the receiver.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah.
And so mounted atop it, I had a low-powered variable rifle scope, and I used that for shooting turkeys, and it was really effective, and it was quite clever. We've talked about this on the podcast before about how shotguns may not necessarily shoot to their intended point of aim due to a number of different circumstances, whether it's how intentionally the shotgun's barrel and rib were set up, where you would have, what we would call like a 50-50 pattern or 60-40 or 70-30 or an 80-20 pattern, or just, inherence to the gun, like they kind of point wherever they want. But with these new loads and these new chokes, that can be a huge detriment to a shooter. You could be throwing this volleyball-sized pattern, but like 2 feet low and left, and then that's not good when you're at 40 yards or 50 yards. And an optic is the way that you really, really rein that in and take advantage of these great patterns and great loads that are out there. So looking at your shotgun, maybe you have something in your safe, and you're like, well, can I do it? So Mark brought in his M2, Benelli product today, and the question is, well, how do you do it?
Right. Yeah.
So
this thing's kind of been set up to be run with just the bead at the front.
Yep.
And one thing is there's so many ways you can do it, and I'm trying to think. Should we just go into that first? Like, what are the many ways you can do it? That seems to make
Well, yeah, and then Ryan. So, and I feel like a lot of shotguns, whether maybe it's a pump or this is an autoloader, kind of fall into like the same bracket of kind of the most popular ways that you can alter this to get a dot on top.
Yes.
Is that safe to say?
Yes.
So like what we could do to this would be the same thing you would do to an 870.
Correct.
Like a standard.
Okay,
870.
yeah.
Correct.
I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So I've seen ones. We were just looking at a number online here before we jumped on, but I've seen you got the speed bead where you take the stock off and it sandwiches this little mount for a red dot, like an open top red dot. Venom, for example, from us would be the nearest thing, and it sandwiches that between the receiver and the stock, and then it puts it right up here near the back.
Yep.
I've seen ones that mount it to the rib.
Yep.
This is not drilled and tapped, so you wouldn't be able to put a pick rail on it, right?
Not without first putting some holes in Mark's receiver.
Not without putting some holes in it. There's ones that come around the side. I don't remember what those are called. That's what Eric is using.
Call it like a saddle.
Saddle.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fitting. And even some of those, they're made, and they're made so that you can use the bead underneath it.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yep, depending on the gun.
What is there a best way?
I think yes and no, right? So let's just jump into each one. I guess we'll talk about pluses and minuses of all of them. So let's start with the speed bead. You had mentioned that one first. This is a real clever device that goes, like Jim said, right between the stock and the receiver. Basically replaces your shim, which is going to control your cast and your drop. And so each gun or each individual might have some different results on this one, but it's really a clever device. Like Jim said, just squishes right between there and provides this little platform I think one of the bigger limiting factors to this is you're kind of limited on your optic options.
Right. It's got to be small, open top. Usually they're like a direct mount, almost like a pistol, right?
Correct. Yep. They'll have a footprint that's going to, be specific to only a few different dots that are out there. Our Venom, our Viper will fit those. If you have a situation in which you've had to cast on or off or lower or raise your comb height based, or I should say your pitch of your stock with a shim, you may lose that. But if we're looking at what the intended use of the gun is at that point with that sighting system, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal.
Right, because if you sight in a red dot, it doesn't necessarily matter where your head is behind it.
Correct.
You just have to have the dot on the thing and then pull the trigger.
Correct.
So those are parallax-free. A bead sight, for all intents and purposes, actually could be affected.
Correct.
By head position.
Yes. Where you?
I don't know if you call that parallax. Is that parallax, or is that just orientation,
more of an alignment
and angle, alignment?
So it's a perspective issue at that point.
Yeah, perspective.
Yep. So you're 100% on that.
Well, with the red dot, you put the dot on the thing. It doesn't matter where your head position is. The dot's on it. Boom.
Correct. So with that being said, great option for something like the Venom or the Viper, with the caveats of you're limited to expressly those dots, and then you may lose some functionality in the shim. If you're not shimming your shotgun in some sort of other than standard form, it's not a big deal either way. I really can't fault them. They're pretty clever. A couple of guys on the consumer sales floor have those set up. They've actually used them for wing shooting, snow goose hunting, and duck hunting, and pheasant hunting.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Huh.
Work pretty slick. That's going to become your primary sighting device at that point in time. You're not going to have like a peek under option for your bead because it's going to obscure like that, perspective when you've shouldered the gun. But it becomes your primary sighting device. Very lightweight, very affordable, super effective method of doing so.
What are your thoughts on when people mount dots to most rifles, AR-15s, AKs, whatever else? Usually they're trying to mount the red dot. I don't want to say far out because I've seen some people take that a little bit too far, for lack of a better term, or no pun intended or whatever. But people will put a red dot on an AR-15 out near the end of the receiver, maybe over the ejection port, for example. They don't put it back up near the charging handle. And that's generally because the housing around the window appears to be bigger. It takes up more of your field of view. If it's up close to your face, whereas if it's a little bit further out, it becomes a smaller thing. It doesn't impede so much of your field of view and your peripherals. With a sighting system like the Speed Bead, for example, and I don't know if like dropping a name or whatever, it seems to be almost like Kleenex, or when you say Speed Bead, people get it. But when you put something like that, it's back near your eye. I mean, if I were to shoulder this, I don't want to screw up my mic, but if I were to shoulder this, the dot's going to be pretty much in front of my face.
Yeah.
Is that for what shotguns are used for? Is that a big deal? Or?
No, I think that's actually kind of a better way to do it. Like if I look at my rifles, I try to mount my non-magnified optics, specifically red dots, as close to the back of my rig as possible.
You do?
I do.
Oh my gosh, Instagram's not going to like you.
I know, right? And the reason for this is I'm increasing my perceived field of view by doing so.
You're talking about your field of view through the
optic, right?
Okay,
so the closer I get that lens element to my eye, the more of what I see through my optic is my field of view. I'm not going to say it's increasing my apparent field of view or actual field of view because it's not, but I'm moving as much of the optic close to my eye as possible. So my dominant eye, my right eye, is looking through as much of the window as I can, and all of my field of view that I can have there is there. Now, if you have any cross-eye dominance, which I do have a little bit of, if I move my optic forward, my left eye can start to see the side of my housing. And if I'm trying to shoot fast, or if I'm trying to shoot something on the move, if my left eye takes over, you can have like this offset image issue that some folks will run into when they're trying to shoot both eyes open with a non-magnified optic. So one of the things that we tell folks, hey, they call up, they're like, hey, I put, your Crossfire red dot or your UH1 on my AR or whatever firearm they're putting it on, and I'm getting like two images. I don't understand what's happening. And often I'll say like, hey, if you close one eye, does it go away? And if the answer, and it generally is yes, then it's a good indicator that there's a subtle cross-eye dominance here. Move the optic closer to your dominant eye, your non-dominant eye can kind of look I guess, past it, or it doesn't interfere as much.
Okay, yeah.
So I actually really like the presentation of the dot with the speed bead. I think it's a good way to go. I might prefer a particular style of dot that isn't conducive to the speed bead, though. And that's where...
Like a tubular style?
Correct.
Crossfire, for example?
Exactly.
Something similar to your aimpoint T1, whatever. That's that form.
Closed housing, or whatever you want to call it. And for turkey hunting specifically. Just because, when we're turkey hunting, it could be raining. There could be some debris coming in if we're crawling through the woods and we're bushwhacking turkeys, which Mark has never done. He said that on a podcast before.
Then I started going back to my memory banks, and I was like, no, that one. Yeah, that one too. I think there was like a total of 4.
Right. And so that would bring us then forward of the speed bead onto the receiver through the various methods of mounting there.
Yeah, if you want to get that crossfire style.
Right.
So different style mounting.
Right. And so then we look at either a saddle type mount or a rail to put on top of the shotgun. So looking at Mark's M2, a saddle on an M2 can be done, or at one time could be done. I'd actually have to do some looking to see if they're still available.
Eric just got one on his 870.
Where his gun would differ than the M2, and where this would be a lot easier, is the means of attachment. So on the Benelli M2 and a variety of other shotguns kind of from that region, they only have one trigger pin. And so we know that if we're trying to anchor something there, if we only have one pin, now we have a pivot point.
Yeah.
And so in the past, some of the saddles that have worked would also go in front of the receiver just behind the handguard, and they'd actually kind of sandwich in place. And that
if you're
would,
watching on YouTube, this is the trigger pin we're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I was just watching a video pre-podcast, and it was on another Benelli Nova, and I think that might have had
two
pins that you remove.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. And so if
That's
there's
a pump, though, right?
It is a pump. Yeah.
Okay.
If you have 2 pins, then the anchor point's really quite intuitive and simple, and it won't have any rock to it or a pivot at that point. And then those are pretty straightforward. But I guess the theory behind the saddle mount is all the same, whether or not you're sandwiching behind the handguard or something else. So that just goes over the top of the receiver, much like a saddle would sit on a horse, and then it would have a mounting platform atop it. So that you could put, generally speaking, a Weaver or Picatinny style or Picatinny compatible optic on, which would include things like the Venom and the Viper, the Crossfire, the Spark AR,
Strike
Fire
Yep.
2 and a low ring.
Any sight that could anchor to a Weaver and or Picatinny, depending on the mount, could go over the top of the receiver. And then we would see it in a more conventionally placed fashion, like you would a rifle scope on a rifle or a red dot on a rifle.
Installation with like that 2-pin system seemed pretty simple.
Pop the pins out, saddle on, pins in.
Just have a tiny hammer and some punches.
Yep. It goes really quick. And it's really intuitive and it's really simple. I like that style. I am not going to really fault it, from the standpoint of a shotgun. Now, if we were doing that on, say, a smoothbore slug gun or even a rifle barrel slug gun, one thing that we have to keep in consideration there is there's a difference in the accuracy of a shotgun versus that of, or I should say accuracy potential of a shotgun with a smoothbore firing shot versus that of a smoothbore firing a slug or a rifle barrel firing a slug. And if you do put a saddle on, and I guess we're just speaking to the slug shooters at this point, understand that our sighting system is now inclusive to our receiver. It's part of our receiver, but our barrel is separate. So we still haven't eked out the total accuracy potential of that, because every time we shoot, that barrel can shift minute amounts, which is going to change our POI.
That happens?
Absolutely. Yep. Especially on, older guns that don't have as tight a fitting a tolerance.
Okay.
So what you'll see then is a higher propensity of accuracy on a shotgun that has a sighting system anchored to the barrel, i.e. the cantilever mount. And that's where that came out of. So the cantilever mount is brazed onto the barrel and then comes up over the receiver. We then mount the optic to the cantilever, which is technically part of the barrel.
You sight it into the barrel.
Correct.
If the barrel shifts,
The scope shifts with it.
shifts with it.
Now, it
Yeah.
doesn't
Okay.
shift enough that you'd all of a sudden be like, oh, man, I got to get my cheek way off the gun to look down the scope again.
No.
We're not talking about like a 45-degree angle. It's but minute changes can make big differences downrange.
Yeah. So if you're shooting a gun that at, say, 50 yards, is capable of 2-minute accuracy, which a lot of smoothbore slug guns, that would be a good position to be in. You might see it being a little larger if you have the saddle type mount.
Okay.
And then again, it might just depend on your individual gun or the style at which your gun, anchors its barrel to its receiver. If we look at the M2, for instance, you'll notice there's a flange on the barrel that interfaces with the front of the receiver.
Mm-hmm.
Some shotguns don't have this. The barrel just simply slips in there, and its controlled stop is actually on the barrel ring up on the forend, and then it tensions down. Or it might interface with the vent rib. The M2's flange on that barrel will help kind of control that or mitigate that.
Gotcha.
So individual results may vary based on shotgun or ammunition type going on there. But for turkey hunters, that's a great option. The saddle mount is low cost, very easy to install, non-permanent. And
now, shift isn't as big of a deal when you're talking about turkey guns and turkey loads, because you're shooting, like you said, that volleyball size thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that shift would not be as perceptible or detrimental to success. And what I really like about the saddle mounts is there's a lot of folks out there that have one shotgun. Like it's their duck gun, it's their clays gun, it's their pheasant gun, it's their turkey gun. And, you use your turkey gun for 2 to 4 weeks out of the year, and you're like, hey, I want to take it apart and turn it back into sporting clays mode. 2 pins, take the saddle off, 2 pins, you're back to field mode, if you will.
That was going to be my big question is for me, this is my do-all shotgun.
Yep.
Like you said, turkeys, ducks, whatever. Generally, this is the one that comes out. So with that being said, though, am I in a little bit of a pickle because I don't have the 2 pins there?
It would depend, again, on the available mounts, and I would have to look into see who's got what available for a saddle type mount for the M2.
Do I need to buy another shotgun?
No, because then we'll get into strong mounting your red dot to your gun.
Why would you tell him no?
I think you should always have more than 10 shotguns.
Okay, I haven't gotten there yet.
Right. But a lot of shotguns nowadays are coming drilled and tapped from the factory. Just like, again, we go back into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a lot of major rifle manufacturers that didn't even drill and tap their receivers.
Right.
They were designed to be used with the iron sights. Classic example, the Marlin 336 or Marlin 36, the lever action guns. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, they're all drilled and tapped. But, back then that wasn't an optic that, necessarily the manufacturer thought their customer base was going to put a scope on, so they didn't. So you can drill and tap this as well. And it sounds like a huge undertaking.
What's the deal with could you do it, though? Because this kind of sinks down.
Yeah, you can.
Would you have to get a Picatinny rail that has that same contour to it?
No, on that setup, so it's just matching the radius on the top of the receiver. And our friends over at EGW Guns have a solution for that.
Would there be a space between the bottom of the rail and then where it threads in?
There would be, but it's going to come in contact with the radius up here.
Oh, so that's not.
It's not a huge deal.
It's not going to be like having a ton of tension on that.
Right.
Fast. Okay.
Right. And there's even some Weaver type rails that can sit on there, and they'll do a good job as well. But to drill and tap is to literally put 2 to 4 holes in the top of your receiver, and then with a tap, which is just think of like the device that cuts the grooves or the threads for your screws. You would have to, first drill holes in there and then run that tap through to form that thread.
Mark, this sounds like a great DIY.
I agree completely.
It makes me nervous.
Well, it does, yeah, because if you goof it up, then you got to plug them and then you got to re-drill them. If done haphazardly, you will not be satisfied with the results. But it's really not that big of an undertaking. If you go down to your local hardware store, you can buy drill and tap kits. If you have a drill press and a little bit of patience, you have the ability to save yourself potentially a couple $100 in gunsmithing fees to punch 4 holes in the top of your receiver and do it.
And so, I know we just talked about that. So when you're punching the holes, then you're punching them on the outside of that groove or on the inside?
On
of
the
that
inside,
groove?
right down the middle.
And there's enough material there?
Yep.
How deep do those usually go?
Through and through.
Oh, all the way through.
Yep.
Okay.
So the biggest thing that we got to look for on this particular shotgun, if you were to take the barrel off, you're going to see this barrel extension, I believe is what the term is called. So we want to take the barrel completely off the gun. Obviously, we're going to take the bolt out, and actually, I'm going to say we're going to take the the shell latch out that holds the shells in the magazine, and then there's some other guts in here that should come out, and the ejector, which is housed on this side of the gun here. We're going to take all the components out of there so that we don't fill them with metal shavings and potentially create a problem.
Makes sense.
And then all we would do is we would locate the best position for the rail. So you can get a long rail, you can even get a short rail that has a single crossbar for mounting something pretty small and obscure and out of the way. We're going to find the center of the receiver, and that's pretty easy too. We're just going to use a dial caliper. We're going to put it on the outsides, and we're going to divide by 2. We're going to mark that line, and then we're going to make perpendicular lines and make sure that they correspond with our hole spacing on the rail section that we're putting in there. We're going to do 2 little pilot holes, and then we're going to do the diameter.
Could you just make like a paper stencil and painters tape it down to the top of the receiver and then just drill into the paper stencil?
100%. It's pretty easy. At that point, once you've got your holes piloted through, then you run the taps, you form the thread, you put the rail on, and you screw it down.
Mark, can't wait to start drilling some holes in your gun.
I'd rather not, Jim. I'd rather buy a new shotgun. Now, let me ask this question, though. We do that.
Yes.
Let's say in Jim's perfect world, we do that.
And it works well.
Everything's, working famously. We've killed multiple birds, had a stellar season. Now I want to transition. I want to go pheasant hunting. Maybe I want to go duck hunting or whatever. And I decide, I don't want to have the dot on there, even though it probably would work just fine.
Sure.
Removing the rail and then kind of doing that on a fairly consistent basis, is that going to have any effect on the gun itself?
Sure. So if you're haphazard with removal and reinstallation, we got to keep in mind that we're putting a steel alloy fastener into an aluminum receiver.
Right.
And you could bugger up a thread, but you could do that on anything, right? So you just got to be mindful of that. If you really went overboard, you could insert helicoils in there. That would be a little bit more than I would want to do myself. The helicoil is going to be a steel insert inside of an aluminum thread that you then either epoxy in place or you put a very strong thread locking compound in there to beef up the strength of that thread. You're going to minimize the amount of stretch that you're going to see or possible deflection or deformation of the thread. I would say just play careful. And, don't go in there and screw that sucker down real tight, because you do run the risk of pulling the thread through. This is no different than, taking on or putting on or taking off a scope rail from, say, a Ruger 1022, because that is also an alloy receiver.
Okay.
You just, proper torque and, an application of serviceable grade thread locker, and you should be okay.
A shotgun that's coming from the factory that's already drilled and tapped.
Mm-hmm.
Are they doing something different because they are?
No. So, it depends. Some guns may, if they have a helicoil insert or if they have a steel receiver. So let's look at a Remington 870. Mm-hmm. That'll have a steel receiver.
Okay, gotcha.
You have much lower risk of tearing a thread or boogering up a thread on a steel receiver with a steel fastener, just because it's steel on steel.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of guns out there that are alloy guns that don't have helicoil inserts in them, and you just need to be mindful of that.
Okay.
Proper torque application is everything. Just like you can strip a thread out on anything, usually it comes from not putting your thread and starting your thread carefully, or running too high a torque, and then we start to buckle that thread in there or strip it out. So that is what I would consider a semi-permanent modification. You can undo it. You will be left with 4 holes in there. If you don't like the 4 holes or 2 holes or however many holes you decide to put in there, depending on the mount that you're putting on there. If you do decide that's not something you want to look at when you're in the field, or you're worried about additional debris getting into the receiver, it's as simple as getting plug screws, which you can also get at your hardware store.
Okay, right.
Sometimes they're metal, sometimes they're plastic. It would just have to correspond with the thread. So if
you'd also want to make sure you don't screw them in unless, do they have like a cap at the top?
Yeah.
You're not talking, they're not like set screws almost, are they?
Because
I'm thinking if you screwed in your screws too far,
like
then
your plug screws?
Yeah, they're going to stick out on the other end.
Yep.
Like when you buy a rifle, it comes with plug screws in it.
Yep, correct. Usually it's a brass plug screw that goes in there. In the case of Tikkas, they're just simple plastic screws that are threaded in there. They're more of a protector and a filler than anything. Good point on that, though. So if you do decide to do this, and you select a piece of weaver rail or Picatinny rail that you're going to make the modification to your gun. Screw length is very important, like Jim said. So if you're running your anchor screws and they're too long, they're going to interfere with your bolt movement.
Right.
So best case scenario, you put your whole thing together, you put your bolt in, you screw your screws down, you figure out you can't move your bolt back and forth. Oh, shoot, okay, pull the screws out, shorten them up a thread or two, and make sure you have good clearance for your bolt raceway to move back and forth and you're not interfering with anything. Worst case scenario, you don't check that. Somehow you manage to get the gun loaded and you fire it, and then you've got these longer screws. Then we potentially damage the bolt. We would almost certainly damage the fastener, if not then rounding out or ovaling the receiver or the holes that are drilled in there. So there is some careful considerations to be made there, but really this is just taking your time. And if you're really worried about it, bring it to a gunsmith that's done drilled and tap jobs before on shotguns.
Cool.
So yeah, that's strong, mounting it to the receiver.
What about torque on that?
So if it's an alloy receiver, I like to say no more than 20 inch-pounds with a serviceable grade thread locker.
AKA blue, pretty much.
Blue, yeah, blue. Or VC3 Vibratite, which is a cool product we use a lot here at the shop. We say that it's jokingly rubber cement for adults. It's not like a super runny liquid. It's more of like a high viscous, almost glue.
It doesn't really get dry,
No,
does it?
It stays kind of boogery.
Yeah.
Or tacky.
Interesting.
And all it's doing is just preventing that fastener from either over-tightening or under-tightening through the duress of recoil and vibration, right?
Okay.
So it's very serviceable.
It just takes up the lash and the threads pretty much.
Yep,
I mean, that's what
100%.
all the thread lockers do.
Yep. And so you can pull it out with about the same amount of resistance as you put it in with, but it's going to keep that fastener from vibrating out under,
Yeah.
you know.
Did we ever chat a little bit about sort of how that works with why we don't put Loctite on the ring
Sure.
screws and stuff? Because those screws are under tension because there's a gap between your ring halves.
Yeah.
And when your screws are under tension, the tension is taking up the lash and the threads, so it doesn't need the thread locker. But then when you ever have a metal-on-metal thing, base to receiver, for example, there's no tension there, so then that needs something like a thread locker to
Right.
take that up.
Right.
I don't know if we ever mentioned that, but
Backing up a little bit, don't put Loctite on your ring screws or thread locker on your ring screws because you'll lubricate the thread and inadvertently drive the torque too high. Yeah.
yep. So mounting it to the barrel.
Yeah.
Is that where we go next?
Yep. So we talked about cantilever mounts. If your shotgun has a cantilevered barrel, then you're good to go. It's brazed onto your barrel. It is your sighting system mounting point. Very straightforward. If you have a ventilated rib shotgun, as Mark does, how the heck do you get a red dot put on that? Over the years, I have seen some pretty interesting means of doing so. From a two-piece clamp-on device, think of like much like your scope ring would clamp onto your Weaver or Picatinny rail. They make mounts that clamp onto your ribs.
Yep.
Very much the same way, just uses tension to hold it in place, a couple of locking features on there. One of the problems is that rib widths and heights and profiles are not synonymous throughout different shotgun manufacturers.
Yeah, it's not really a standard.
No.
There's no mil
I was
spec
going to say
rib.
there's no mil spec.
Right. And even rib designs are not standard either. So if we look at this Benelli, for instance, this is an M2 again, the rib is one piece and it's brazed on to the barrel. So it's got a profile like a cross section that's similar to like a T, right? Well, if we look at a Mossberg
Yeah, it looks
rib,
like a bridge.
yeah, if we look at a Mossberg rib, like on my Mossberg 835, the rib islands are attached to the barrel. The rib is attached to the islands. So there's like three components to this now. Now we have to take into some consideration of how we're affixing it to it, and are we pulling the rib up off the islands, or are we pulling the islands up off the barrel? And then also, whether or not the rib width is going to be compatible with the device that we're using to clamp to it. So that Mossberg 835, for example, is a very wide rib. Benelli M2s, being a field gun, have a fairly narrow rib. So the two parts might not be able to work together. So the good news is that there's a lot of shotguns out there and the manufacturers who do make rib clamp mounts, if we'll call them that, have taken this into consideration, either through making specific mounts for specific ribs or shims or like various clamping mechanisms that will make up the difference in that rib width and rib height.
Right.
There are a couple out there. Some of them are as simple as you put them on your gun, you screw them together, they're good to go. You put your optic on there. Some of them are, very specific to a particular type of gun, like a Mossberg 500 or a Remington 870 or a Benelli shotgun. And you do have to do some investigations into that, before purchase. There's also a couple of folks out there. We saw this in the multi-gun world before we really saw it prevalent in the hunting world. And so if you're listening to this and you've got a shotgun that doesn't readily accept a rib rider mount of some kind, this is an option as well. You'll notice here on the Benelli's barrel, for instance, at the last island, and for those who are watching, I'm pointing towards a feature on the rib that's solid. So it goes all the way down to the barrel, and then that's the first one that we see on the barrel. You can cut a dovetail into this that would correspond with a red dot mount.
Like from a Glock or something.
Yeah, correct. So we were doing this, and we were drifting in rear sights into our shotgun ribs so that we could shoot slugs on the fly when we were shooting multi-gun.
Interesting.
They weren't so obtrusive that we would lose our sight picture when we were shooting aerial targets or when we were doing a speed array of like clay pigeons that were static. So we would just dovetail these little low-profile rear sights in from like 1911s or Glocks or things like this. Well, the guys who were shooting open class that would allow you to put like a red dot on your gun were dovetailing into this receiver or into this rib, and then they were drifting in a rear sight dovetail mount for a pistol. And Glocks were very popular because they're flat on the back and this rib is flat up here. This was a super simple solution. And this is, again, something you could do at home with enough patience and time.
How do you cut a dovetail in?
So the right way to do it is with a dovetail cutter and a mill.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Right. So if you don't have a Bridgeport in your garage, and if you do, I envy you, and can I come over and hang out? You could do it with a series of files. So all we're doing there is we're cutting to depth. So we're going to take a draw file and we're going to work down to the proper depth, and then we're going to find a file that has the correct angle on it, and we're just going to open gradually that rib until we have cut that dovetail section out. And this is one of those things where metal can be a little more forgiving than wood when you're carving it or cutting it. But once you take away too much, you generally can't put it back, not very neatly anyway.
Right.
So if you do dovetail it in and you are doing it at home and you don't have a dovetail cutter on a high-speed mill to just make a double or single pass and then you've got your dovetail cut, take your time. But it can be done, and it's like a 20-minute operation.
Mark, I can't wait to start
It's not happening.
drilling holes, cutting dovetails. Man, this thing is going to
I can tell you unequivocally
done.
that's not happening.
It's going to be
And
so
also,
great.
no, it's not going to be so great. You look at it, something like that. So, dude, I guarantee I'll
He's
be
broken.
Let's say I am broken. If I indeed, which I don't, wanted to do this at this point in time, I would spend more money having my shotgun repaired after we screwed it up than had we not just had somebody do it that has the proper equipment like Ryan is talking about.
I'm going to tell you, if you had two files to do, like a triangle-shaped file and like a regular bastard file to just cut into that, we're talking 20 to 45 minutes, and we can drift in a
Actually
dovetail.
Pretty big range.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how slow you go, right?
Okay.
So we're cutting to depth, and then we're opening up that dovetail. And we're talking about a piece that's going to be no more than about 3/8 of an inch wide by about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch deep. So
Ryan, I'll get a Benelli, and then we'll do all this stuff we've been talking about.
we're going to put
I'll
dots,
have 3 red dots on this thing.
line
Oh
them all
my
up for
gosh.
the ultimate accuracy. But
Ultimate co-witness.
it is something that can certainly be done. So,
All focusing on
I
the
can't
front,
remember which one's my turkey dot.
focusing on the front bead.
right. So it's not like you're not without option, right? So it's always there. It may take a little bit of gun plumbing at home, but you can do it. You can do it. A little bit of file, a little bit of patience, and it's not a huge ordeal. And there's a ton of options out there. I think
Vortex Optics is not responsible for your own gun manipulation
exactly.
or customization.
faulty gun plumbing.
Faulty gun plumbing is not at all a result of this podcast.
Well, yeah. So it can be done. Good thing Mark's probably got to go on assignment this week. We'll just keep his gun back here, and when he comes back,
No way. That's coming with me. That's my truck gun right now.
Oh,
I shouldn't
man.
tell people that.
But it can be done. There are
What are
multiple.
they going to do about it? Come up to your truck?
There are multiple options to do this, and all are effective. So really, then I guess do we get into why a red dot on a shotgun?
Well, I think why a red dot on a shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'm curious about sort of the future of shotguns and optics, and so many people, like you mentioned, rifles used to be pretty much irons only, and then optics came on scene. When the optics originally came on scene for rifles, even a lot of people were probably like, pish posh optics, I can do just fine with my irons. And then they got so good, and so many people started realizing how great it was, and also the technology of the optics on top improved, that they realized, no, well, you know what? Irons are still a cool thing. Not going to poo-hoo them. Still have their place, but optics are kind of king now. A lot of guns come without even any iron sights on them at all anymore. Most of them do. Pistols, people are starting to put optics on pistols more and more. You hear people talking about the future of handguns and the fact that it's likely that soon enough, in whatever time, I can't predict the future, but most pistols will be coming optics ready with an optic on them.
That'll be the standard.
Yes.
And shotguns, I can't tell because I feel like some people actually, with rifles and handguns, there's when you put an optic on it, you use it. And even though it may take a little getting used to, you see, wow, this is better.
Yes.
Shotguns, I feel like some people look at it and for certain uses, maybe the bead is almost better.
More so uses than anything.
Right? So what uses is a bead preferred over a red dot, for example?
For me, and this is user dependent, for me, a bead front sight is far superior for wing shooting than a red dot will be. And I think there's kind of a caveat to this. So one, I have not taken the time to put a dot on my gun to go shoot clays. So what?
It'd be an interesting experiment.
Right. But the same can be said, though, for like a red dot on a pistol. When I first shot a red dot on a pistol, I was garbage. I mean, it was a complete and total... I mean, it was like trying to drive a manual transmission, having never done it.
Yeah.
And then, I think over time you develop your proficiencies with that sighting device, and you become probably superior to your counterpart shooting an iron-sighted pistol. The first time I had done that was at a USPSA, like an action shooting thing. I traded rigs with one of my coworkers who was shooting a, quote, open pistol that had a red dot on it. And I would have shot better in my respective class had I been shooting my standard pistol, just because I had zero familiarity with how to use a gun with a red dot on it. The same can be true with a red dot on a shotgun. I would say that most people shooting a shotgun would shoot a shotgun in the traditional form, that is with a proper cheek weld and a bead front. We're not actually using the bead to aim at the clay bird or the duck or goose or whatever we're shooting, grouse. It's more of an instinctive shooting scenario.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the things that hangs people up when they use a red dot on a pistol is that when you throw a red dot in the mix, all of a sudden it feels like this more precise aiming point. And suddenly where it used to be, the irons are close is definitely close enough at pistol distances, and when you actually start shooting with irons, you don't pay attention to so much exactly what point on the iron is exactly on what point of the target. You just are sort of like front sight's there, boom.
Yep.
And then a red dot comes into play, and you can kind of see all your individual hand shakes and whatnot with the red dot dancing there, and you think, oh, I got to get this red dot perfectly in. And next thing you know, you're going way slower.
Correct.
And you're actually, if you're concentrating that much, and then all of a sudden you're trying to go, now, then you're actually shooting bigger groups. You're not as accurate.
Yep. And that's me with a handgun and a red dot. And I think it would be me I know it would be me with a shotgun and a red dot shooting wing target, like clay birds or birds. Until you can get into kind of the subconscious use mindset where it's like, oh, there's my sighting device. Great. My reference has been established, proper tracking and targeting of that bird, and then follow through, squeeze, break the clay, or drop the duck. You may find it not intuitive or somewhat difficult at first when shooting a red dot on a shotgun at aerial targets. Once you've practiced it, then it's not a big deal. I think it, like we'd said, becomes somewhat subconscious. And if we look at how shooting a shotgun works and actual follow through targeting and execution of the shot on an aerial target, the sighting system is more or less subconscious at that point. So yeah, you'd have to go out and practice it.
Do you think it would help you potentially learn proper leads? You'd have that possibly maybe more of a visual reference to be like, oh, the bird was doing this or the clay was doing this.
Yep.
And I've got this mental snapshot of where the bead was when I broke the shot and I hit behind. I know I hit behind.
Yep. It could definitely.
When you say bead, are you talking about the actual bead or the red dot?
The red dot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yes, I think
the dot.
I think it definitely could. You'd have to give yourself the time to practice a red dot for aerial targets. And I think one of the bigger issues at hand with that is actually the presentation of the dot relative to your comb height. Mm-hmm. So if you shoulder your shotgun right now, your eyeball is lined up in a perfect scenario, if your stock is fit properly and shimmed correctly, your eyeball is lined up with more or less the top of the flat part of the rib. You don't see any of the rib. You just have this, square profile with the little bead sitting right on top of it. Nothing else. It doesn't look like a ramp or a runway. It's just, that's what you see is this little square box with a bead on top. When we put the red dot on there, now we're breaking our cheek weld or breaking our true form or proper form on the shotgun, and we're lifting our head up.
Right.
Now this can impose a whole bunch of issues with form and follow through and swing and that kind of thing. And again, the shooter would have to practice it in order to gain proficiency. But I can't, running the scenario through my head, state with any level of definity that a red dot is somehow going to be a less effective means of sighting a shotgun than a bead front would be, all things considered equal otherwise. At that point in time, you learn your follow through, you learn your form, you learn your function, you shoot your gun and break your bird. What I found when I was putting it up and doing the limited amount of shooting with a red dot on a shotgun for aerial targets is I was consciously focused on my sighting device and not on my target, and I shot behind every bird that I missed. That was it. It wasn't an issue with calculating leads. I was in my form and follow through, okay, and there's my dot. Now I pull the trigger. Well, I broke my concentration on my target, and I put it on my dot, and then I goofed the whole thing up.
Yep.
Whereas I have good friends of mine that have the ability to shoot an aerial target with the same or greater, degree of proficiency with a red dot than I do with a bead. But it comes
I could see that just being something to get used to.
Right.
As with anything that requires speed in the subconscious.
Yep.
When you throw something new into the mix, all of a sudden that's something you have to be conscious about, and then it slows down the subconscious part.
Right. But if we look at action shooting, and I hate to come back to it, but I love to come back to it because it's a great kind of barometer for this. If you look at open class shooters and their degree of proficiency and accuracy and speed all bundled together, open class shooters in USPSA shoot remarkably higher scores in remarkably lower times. And it's not like they're taking that extra time or that person is just that much faster to say, okay, dot is centered in the A zone and execute, break, go. They're still on that semi-subconscious level where the dot is in their view, but they're focused on their target and they're breaking their splits faster and faster and faster. And a good example of this is watch an open class shooter run a plate rack or a Texas Star or a variety of arrays of IPSC targets just faster. And their hits are all generally fairly centered and just faster because they've picked up the ability to catch that dot. They know where that's centered. They know where that's appropriate for pistol distances or the distance that they're shooting. They execute the shot and they're moving on to the next target before I've even lined up my irons. I'm going, okay, that's good. So you can do it. It just takes a little bit of time. For the turkey hunter or for the big game hunter, I think it's an undeniable advantage, especially when we start talking about the nuances of shotguns and pointing in weird directions. You can actually sight your red dot in for your shotgun.
Right. You can. It sounds like when we're talking, and this is backtrack now, almost when we first started, but you are accommodating for like that offset.
Yeah. And then it becomes a tremendous advantage. And we're not shooting a flying target necessarily.
Right. You are aiming at that point.
Yeah. You are using that much like you would a red dot on a carbine, and you're using it as a defined hold point, and you're executing the shot. And it is absolutely an advantage at that point. And that's why I enjoy hunting with a red dot on my turkey gun so much, because I have the ability to zero my red dot for where my shotgun's pattern is going. And it's tremendously helpful. And if you have aging eyes or poor vision in the first place and you can't make out your bead or your target at the same time, having the red dot there takes care of that.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit too. Like you're talking about these, modern turkey loads and what the guns and the loads can do. And what does your sight picture look like with a red dot compared to maybe just a front bead if you're shooting at a bird that's maybe 40, 50, 60 yards?
Yeah, big time difference for me. I'm seeing the whole turkey. I've got this finite aiming point, a 2-minute dot or a 3-minute dot or a 4-minute dot that I can control the intensity of depending on, the ambient light or what kind of cover I'm in or whatever. And now I've got this whole target, this whole bird in my viewfinder, and I've got this nice, precise aiming point, and I can set it on the particular part of that target that I'm trying to shoot. Whereas if I'm just on my bead, if this is a fairly distant bird,
right,
that bead is much larger than the dot is.
Yeah.
And you could spend the time to calculate it out, but we're talking like 10, 20 minutes of angle comparatively. And then you've got your rib interfering with it too. And I can absolutely remember taking turkeys where I had to very, very much so bear down and make sure everything was lined up correctly and that my rib wasn't canted or like I was not, off kilter on the gun or not behind it. And then I only have this tiny little bit of the bird's head visible,
right,
because my bead is obscuring the rest. I missed a turkey because of that.
Yep.
And that's why I switched to an optic on my turkey gun. I mean, clean miss. And the optic eliminates that. Like I've got this very defined aiming point because we're trying to hit something about the size of a pop can at 40 yards.
Yep.
And having that bead there is tremendous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about now? One thing actually, I realized we hadn't talked a lot about yet. We mostly red dots, magnified optics on shotguns. That primarily is happening with slug guns, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And when it comes to putting those on, what does one look for in the optic that they choose?
Again, personal preference. For me, on a slug gun, if I'm hunting big game with it, they're fairly limited range, right? Most slug guns, unless you buy one of those, high performance bolt action shotguns or like the guns that are built specifically for slugs, where you can shoot those 2,000 foot per second sabot type slugs that are 200 yard accurate. I'm looking at a generally shorter range rig. We'll just say 100 to 125 yards. In slug country, where I hunt with it, it's going to be tighter country. I'm looking for a lower magnification optic with a generous field of view that if I decide I'm going to go, say, drive deer or still hunt through timber, I want that optic on the lower end of its magnification range for very fast sight acquisition, big field of view. And then if I have to go up and take a 100 or 125 yard shot, I can turn it to 4 or 6 and have more than I would need to do so.
Yeah.
So I like a 1-4, like the Crossfire 2 1-4. We mount a bunch of those every fall for guys that still hunt with that kind of gun. We recommend that all the time to the folks up in the Northeast and in the Midwest that are still, in a slug-only zone.
Yep.
Really, really nice optic for that kind of thing. And actually would do very good double duty in the turkey woods too. But on a slug gun, that's a really nice fit. If you do have one of the more high-performance setups, you can sneak away with a little bit more magnification. But I still never would go above anything like a 3 to 9.
Yeah.
Like we're starting to get into a little bit too much scope for application.
Yeah.
At least we do a lot of our slug hunting.
What do you tell people when they ask, like, obviously we don't really only speak to ours, but
Yeah.
shotguns have a lot of recoil.
Oh, yeah.
Is the optic going to hold up to it fine?
If mounted properly, yes.
Yeah.
In a previous podcast, Ruben and I talked about going out and doing a 271 slug salute.
Ugh.
Yeah, it was terrible.
Barf.
In an attempt to see what can a scope take, and we broke the gun. Scope was fine. So, and we did. We broke the gun.
That was with that crossfire that you were just talking about, wasn't it?
That was a 3 to 9 by 40 with the V-Bright reticle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
But at proper torque values in good rings on a good mounting platform, no issue.
Right.
And that's to go with rifle scopes on rifles.
That's everything.
Yes.
Right.
Proper torque value, good rings. You have to make the precision instrument fit the precision instrument with precision instruments, and then it'll be just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all about
Precision instruments, like a hand file that you find in your desk drawer at home that you're going to alter my shotgun with.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do have a set of needle files downstairs. We could have this done by the end of the day.
I've got some files too.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll go lock it up.
Stay tuned for that, everybody. And if tying Mark up and manipulating his own shotgun for him doesn't work, I'll get one and we'll make some videos.
Sounds hot, Jim.
April 1st is right around the corner. We could definitely trick Mark into believing that we were not using a chainsaw on his gun to fit it.
But optics on shotguns, though. Did we cover pretty much everything from the questions we've got? We've received some questions since we've done shotgun episodes on people asking, probably naturally so, Vortex Optics about optics on shotguns. Yeah, is there anything else?
I want to throw out a pro tip for the guys getting set up, guys and gals getting set up for turkey guns and red dots. And that is, turkey loads are expensive.
This is a biggie.
Yeah, they could be upwards of $10 a shell. A mistake that I have made in the past has gone out to pattern my turkey shotgun with a red dot on it and brought only my turkey loads. So again, like your rifle, you mount your scope up on there and then you do a bore sight and then you try to get it lined up. That may work, that may not work. What I would recommend doing if you put a red dot on your scatter gun for setting up for turkeys is bring some trap loads out there so that you can do the bulk movements of your optic with the very inexpensive and much, much more palatable to shoot trap loads. So you don't go burn up a bunch of 3.5 inch, 2 1/4 ounce turkey loads into your shoulder and into your wallet. So you make your gross adjustments with your trap loads, do your finite finishing with.
That goes against conventional wisdom, because a lot of people would say, and we have said in the past, if you're going to be if you're going to go shoot precision rifle, don't do all your practicing with the crap ammo and then go out and expect the precision ammo to do exactly the same stuff. But
little different scenario.
Little bit. And also you're talking about more, you can't bore sight a shotgun.
Not well.
No. So this is almost like your bore sighting, if you will. You're not using those trap loads to actually determine what your turkey loads will do or how they'll perform.
Right.
You're just using it to get the red dot pretty close.
Getting a pretty darn close ballpark.
Yeah.
Now, Ryan, here's another question. At what distance would you want to pattern? At what distance do you want to sight in your shotgun with the trap loads, and then the same when you transition to your turkey loads for that final step?
Yep. This is a good question, and this one is
different.
Very oft debated. So I've heard recently guys say, if you zero your red dot at 10 yards, you're on at 40. And I don't know where that came from. Or whether or not that holds true for anything, because it would be very much gun and load dependent.
And also probably optic height dependent.
Big time. So that the presentation of that optic is going to dictate that a lot. Just like we wouldn't take our bow and say zero it at 6 yards and say, we're on all the way to 80 now. You could be, maybe, depending on your arrow weight and your vanes and your knock point and your broadhead weight. I mean, all that other stuff. Same holds true with shotguns. So when I zero my turkey guns, I do it at 25 yards. And some people are like, wait, what? I check at other distances to see what my patterns look like. What's my pattern density at 40 or even 50, just to get an idea of where my, level of effectiveness is going to be, or my boundary of effectiveness, for taking a turkey at a given distance. But 25 yards is where I do it. And how I settled on that number, I guess I don't know. I've always done that. I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think that further is probably better than closer, because you might get a pretty misleading pattern at 10 yards and your wad might still be traveling and cutting a hole in your paper at that distance.
Right.
So 25 yards is kind of where I sell. 25, 30 yards, somewhere in there would be more than fine. I still do encourage people, especially for turkey hunters, check your patterns at the distances that you might be comfortable taking a bird
Right.
at. You may be surprised to see that a gun that at 30 yards patterns 100%. You're getting, inside of your defined or predetermined circle, all of your pellets at 30 yards may not be doing that at 50. Or vice versa. Every shotgun is going to be a little bit different depending on the choke and the load that you're shooting. And you will have to draw a line in the sand and say, like, okay, we're good to here. Once we get to here, things get a little sketchy. We're starting to see a lot more pattern throwing. Maybe you're seeing a consistent hole develop in your pattern. It depends on your gun. There's no hard answer to, you want a 0 at 30 yards or 40 or 10 or whatever. 25 is where I just did. I think where it came from? The gun club, when I started shooting optics on turkeys, had a 25-yard bay. And so that's where I did it at. And then I validated my stuff in the 50-yard bay.
Makes sense.
That makes perfect sense, because if you've turkey hunted, sometimes you kill them at 5 yards, sometimes you kill them at 50 yards, and in between, and all sorts of good stuff. So
that's a good question.
Sweet. All right, well, look at that. Right in an hour. On
Bingo.
the money.
Wow.
Nailed it.
With that being said, let us know if there's any other shotgun stuff you want to hear, or just other stuff. This one came as a result of many suggestions, so we do listen to the suggestions, and we like getting them. So hit us up at Vortex Nation Podcast on Instagram or any other means, whatever works. We get all kinds of suggestions. People send them via email. Anyway, I don't know. But yes, thank you as usual for listening. Mr. Ryan, thank you. As always.
Happy to be
Somebody
here.
just recently commented on a podcast, said you are their spirit animal.
Goodness gracious.
It's
an honor.
It wasn't me.
So also let us know if Ryan Muckenhern is your spirit animal as well. But yeah, we'll catch you next time though. Thanks everybody, and bye.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
To end on a voice crack. I don't know if you guys heard my
I
bye.
didn't
It was
hear
like,
it.
Bye.
Oh, God. Oh, jeez. Bye, everybody. Mr. Wazowski. You're messing up his focus.
That voice. That's a great movie, by the way. It's one of my favorite movies.
That's the
I just watched that movie this last weekend.
Monsters, Inc.
Yeah.
I've watched a lot of Monsters Inc.
Sorry, Mr. Sullivan.
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. Again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.